She lived alone, but one day she took in a strange kitten. He grew fast, too fast. And when thieves broke into the house, it became clear this was no cat. A story about kindness, loyalty, and a wild predator that found a home. Watch till the end. You won't forget this tale. In the village of Podgornaya, nestled among hills that turned lush and green in summer and slumbered beneath snowdrifts in winter, stood a crooked old log house on the very edge of town, where the last wooden huts faded into dense thickets of bird cherry and alder. Its sagging shutters and creaky porch groaned with every step. The walls, darkened by time and weather, still held the warmth of the stove and the scents of dried mushrooms, mint, milk, and fresh-baked bread. Here lived Granny Agafya, the last of the Koroveni family in these parts. Once the house was full of life, children laughing, dishes clattering, floorboards creaking under the weight of her husband's heavy boots. But the years took everything. The children grew up and moved to the cities. Her husband died of an illness that neither village healers nor city doctors could cure. The grandchildren rarely called, visited even less. Life in the city moved fast, while here, time flowed like honey from an overturned jar. Her only companions now were cats. Every morning, she filled 5 bowls, a piece of fish for Barsik, porridge with milk for Mashka and Dusia, the same as her own breakfast for Vaska, and soaked bread in warm broth for Pushok, because his teeth couldn't handle anything hard. After breakfast, she'd walk around the house checking if everything was in its place. In the evenings, she sat in a chair by the stove, knitting or reading an old book, telling the cats stories about how the house once smelled of pies on Sundays, how the children used to run through the yard, how her husband built furniture that still stood in the corner. The cats listened, some dozing, others staring at her with yellow or green eyes. "You're my good ones," she'd say, scratching one behind the ear. Not like people. They've forgotten this old woman. But what she missed most was children's laughter. She caught herself sometimes talking aloud to those who were no longer there, her husband, whose funeral she had to carry out in pouring rain, her daughter, who'd moved to the city and last called 3 months ago, her grandson, who once ran through the yard and now didn't even answer her messages. The house was full of shadows from the past, but one autumn day, as cold rain tapped on the roof and the wind chased yellow leaves down the street, a faint, pitiful squeak came from under the porch. Autumn always crept slowly into Podgornaya. First the birch leaves yellowed at the edges. Then the first cold clouds gathered above the forest. Soon, Granny Agafya was stoking the stove not just in the evenings, but mornings too. That day, the rain began before noon, fine and stubborn, turning the earth to sticky black mush. She returned from the market late, her bag heavy with bread and groceries. The path to the house had turned to mud, each step harder than the last. Almost at the gate, she stopped. Amid the rain's murmur came a thin, pleading sound. Frowning, she set the bags down and listened. There it was again, coming from below. She bent down, moved aside the wet boards that shielded the space under the porch, and froze. On the damp ground sat a tiny grey bundle, a kitten, so dirty and soaked that its fur's color was indistinguishable. It trembled, fuddled in a corner, its huge yellow eyes looking up at her with a silent question. "Will you take me?" "Oh, Lord," whispered Agafya. She reached out, expecting it to hiss or run. But it did neither. It stretched toward her fingers, nuzzled her palm, and squeaked again. She carefully lifted it. It was light as a feather and cold. Immediately, it pressed against her chest, as if searching for the last warm place on earth. "Let's go home, poor thing." The house was quiet. Barsik dozed on the stove, Mashka on the windowsill. The others were scattered in their favorite corners. Only Pushok, catching the unfamiliar scent, lifted his head and stared at her. She wrapped the kitten in an old rag, dried it gently, then grabbed a drier towel and rubbed its frozen body. Beneath the grime, its fur wasn't just grey. It was an unusual ashen hue, with dark rings on the tail and faint stripes on its legs. "Well, you're not an ordinary one," she murmured. The kitten sneezed, stretched, and weakly nudged her hand with its nose. "Hungry." She warmed some milk, poured it into a saucer, and set it down. At first, it sniffed cautiously. Then, as if afraid someone would take it away, attacked the milk with such desperation that it choked. "You must not have eaten in a long time," she sighed. Once it finished, she picked it up and examined it. Ears intact, eyes clear, paws uninjured, just small, hungry, and terribly alone. "Where's your mother?" she asked aloud. In response, the kitten purred, softly, barely audibly, but it was the first sound not born of fear or hunger, but perhaps of comfort. "All right," said Granny. "You'll stay here for now." He simply licked the baby kitten's ear and left. Soft little fluff. He came closer, stared at the kitten for a long time, then lay down next to him and started licking his back. "You see," Grandma said, stroking Fluff's head, "you're not alone, little one." She had already mentally named the kitten Senka. It seemed he understood. He rubbed his tiny face against her palm and purred. A week passed, then another. Senka grew not by the day, but by the hour. He turned out to be incredibly gluttonous, devouring everything given to him, and immediately demanding more. His fur, now clean and fluffy, shone with a silver sheen. Dark spots appeared on his chest and paws, like a little leopard. But what amazed Grandma most were his eyes, large, round, bright yellow with vertical pupils. They gazed at the world with an almost unfeline consciousness. "You're something special," she'd say, scratching behind his ear. Senka purred in response, then curled up in her lap and fell asleep. A month later, he was larger than all the other cats. His paws became massive, his tail thick and fluffy, and his gaze heavy. The neighbors who came by for herbs or a chat would shake their heads. "That's no ordinary cat," said old Nikifor, peering at Senka. "Looks like a Maine Coon, or maybe some kind of wild beast." "What beast?" Grandma waved it off. "He's just a cat." But sometimes even she caught herself thinking that Senka didn't act like the others. He didn't chase yarn balls or sunlight, didn't fight Barsik for a spot on the stove. He just watched, sat by the window staring into the forest, or followed Grandma closely as if guarding her. One day, she slipped on a wet floor, and Senka was there in a heartbeat, worriedly staring into her eyes. "It's all right, son," she whispered, stroking his head. Senka purred and rubbed his cheek against her hand. That evening, when Grandma went to bed, he settled at her feet as usual, but not before staring at her with those yellow eyes, as if trying to say something. Winter came to Podgornie suddenly. One morning, Grandma Agafya woke to an unusual silence. Outside, thick white snow blanketed everything, absorbing all sound. Only the occasional bird track dotted the pristine whiteness. The house was warm. The stove crackled. Cats dozed in corners, all except Senka. He sat by the window, unmoving as a statue, staring into the forest. His yellow eyes seemed to see what human eyes could not. "What do you see?" Grandma asked, approaching. Senka slowly turned his head, looked at her, then turned back to the window. She sighed and began her morning chores, filled the bowls, stoked the fire, brewed tea. The cats gradually woke up, stretched, came to eat. The ginger cat sat on the stove, never taking his eyes off Senka. His fur was ruffled, ears pinned back, tail twitching nervously. "Barsik, come eat," Grandma called. Barsik didn't move. He just growled softly when Senka finally stepped away from the window and headed to his bowl. What's gotten into them today? Agafya wondered. She hadn't yet noticed that the other cats were also behaving oddly. Mashka didn't approach her food until Senka moved away. Dusia shrank back when he passed by. Even gentle Fluff grew wary, though he usually treated Senka with indulgence. "What, did you all make a pact?" Grandma muttered, puzzled. Senka seemed oblivious. He ate slowly, with dignity, not like the others. No lunging, no haste. Then he walked over, rubbed against her leg, and curled up by the stove into a large fluffy ball. Days passed, and the oddities grew. The cats, once content to nap anywhere, now clearly avoided Senka. If he lay on the stove, Barsik moved to the windowsill. If he passed by, Dusia flattened her ears and leapt aside. Even calm Vasya now preferred to keep his distance. Grandma noticed other things. Senka never meowed. He purred, a low, deep rumble like a tiny engine, but never made typical cat sounds. His movements were smooth, almost silent, even when he ran. Sometimes Grandma caught herself thinking, he didn't look at her like a cat at a human, but as an equal to an equal, as if he understood every word. "Bring me some yarn," she once said, just to test him. Senka lifted his head, looked at the basket in the corner, then at her, but didn't move. "Well, fine," Grandma chuckled. "Maybe you don't understand." But that evening, when she coughed, trying to rise from her chair, Senka was at her side in an instant, pressing his body against her, as if afraid she'd fall. He looked into her eyes, anxious, attentive. "It's nothing, son," she soothed, stroking his head. "Old age isn't an illness." He purred in reply, but his pupils stayed narrow, alert. The neighbors began to notice too. "Agafya, what is that creature of yours?" Marfa asked, peeking in. "Looks like a cat, but not quite." "Cat's a cat," Grandma waved it off. "What kind of cat?" Old Nikifor shook his head. "Look at him, paws like shovels, tail like a chimney pipe, and eyes like an owl's." Senka, in such moments, would sit perfectly still, only his ears twitching slightly, as if listening. In the moonlit yard, Senka stood with his back arched. His fur was bristled, his tail puffed up, and a low, raspy growl escaped his throat. Just a few steps away sat a large fox, red with black paws and a predatory snarl. The fox, who usually wasn't afraid even of dogs, was retreating. Senka stepped forward. The fox leapt back. Another step, and the fox turned and vanished into the darkness. Senka watched after him for a few more seconds, then slowly turned and headed toward the house. Grandma had rushed back to bed when the door creaked and heavy paws rustled across the floor. She pretended to be asleep. Senka came closer, stood silently for a moment, then gently licked her hand and curled up at her feet. "You're no cat," she whispered to herself. Outside, the wind stirred the snow as if trying to erase the traces of a strange nocturnal encounter. In the morning, she examined Senka in the daylight. His fur was denser than that of any regular cat, with an undercoat thick like a wild animal's. His ears were slightly rounded, with barely visible tufts. And his eyes, not the eyes of a house cat. That winter, unrest came to Pod Gornoy. First, old Nikifor's chicken vanished. Then, Marfa discovered her cellar supplies missing. Neighbors whispered that a pack of stray dogs was prowling the village. Or maybe a wolf had wandered from the forest. But no tracks were ever found, only snow, smoothed as if someone had carefully swept it behind them. Grandma Agafya listened to these conversations while sipping tea on the bench by the stove. From time to time, she glanced at Senka. He lay at her feet, curled into a massive grey ball, either sleeping or pretending to. "You should go outside once in a while," she grumbled, scratching him behind the ear. "Getting fat on the stove like Barsic." Senka cracked one eye open, gave her a look of silent reproach, and closed it again. But in the evening, as Grandma went to bed, he always slipped out into the yard, quiet as a shadow. She saw how he disappeared into the darkness and heard the snow crunching under his heavy paws somewhere far away. In the morning, she'd find strange gifts on the porch, a small hare or a partridge. "Oh, you little hunter," she'd say, shaking her head as she looked at the latest catch. Senka would sit nearby, licking his paw, looking very pleased with himself. That night, Grandma awoke to an unnatural silence. Even the stove didn't crackle, only the wind howled in the chimney. She listened. No breathing, no soft paw steps across the floor. "Senka?" she called in a whisper. No answer. She was about to get up when suddenly she heard a creak. Not the kind old houses make, but a cautious creak, deliberate, made by a human hand. Someone was at the door. Grandma froze. In Podgornoy, doors weren't locked. Why would they be when everyone knew each other? But now, her fingers instinctively reached for the axe by the stove. The creak came again. Then a light knock, as if testing how firmly the latch held. And then a growl. Low, hoarse, more like a bear's roar than a cat's hiss. Grandma leapt from the bed. A scream rang out behind the door. Then heavy footsteps. Another scream. And a wild roar that made the window panes tremble. She flung the door open. On the porch, two large men in dark clothes were thrashing about. One lay in the snow, covering his face with his hands. The other swung a knife wildly in front of him. Between them, blocking their way, stood Senka. But it wasn't the Senka who slept on her pillow. His fur stood on end, making him look twice as big. His eyes blazed in the dark like two yellow lanterns. From his open mouth jutted long, white fangs, not cat-like at all. He growled and hissed, each sound a whip crack. One of the thieves lunged with the knife. Senka moved, not with a leap, but with a strange, sliding step. The blade whistled through the air, but the beast was already behind the man. A scream. Grandma saw dark droplets hit the snow. "Run!" the first one yelled. They fled, stumbling, falling, leaving bloody tracks behind. Senka took a few steps after them, then stopped and turned. His eyes met Grandma's. "Come here," she said with a trembling voice. Senka approached. His fur was wet. A dark stripe stretched across his chest. Was it his own blood? "Come inside." He crossed the threshold, and in that moment, it was as if all the strength left him. He staggered, and Grandma caught him under the belly just in time. "Idiot," she whispered, sitting on the floor and pulling him to her. "You fool, you could have died." Senka weakly nudged her hand with his nose. By morning, the village was buzzing. Two strangers had been found by the roadside, one with his face torn, the other with deep scratches on his arms. They mumbled something about a devil cat and a monstrous beast. Old Nikifor stood at her doorstep, twisting his hat in his hands. "They say you've got some kind of creature here." "Just a cat," Grandma replied calmly. "What kind of cat is that?" "A cat," she repeated firmly. Nikifor peered past her into the dim room. Two yellow eyes gleamed in the shadows and quickly backed away. "Well, just be careful." When he left, Grandma closed the door and turned around. Senka sat in the middle of the room, licking his paw. On his chest was a crusted wound. Shallow, but visible. "Come here," she said. He approached. Grandma took a rag, soaked it in warm water, and gently wiped the fur around the wound. Old Nikifor shook his head, sitting on the bench outside the village store. "I've seen those in the zoo," he muttered. "They're called manals. Wild and vicious. Could tear a man apart." "Oh, come on," Martha waved him off, though there was doubt in her voice. "Well, he saved the old lady, didn't he? That's all that matters." Granny Agafya had heard the village gossip, but never joined in. She sat at home, donning an old sweater, occasionally glancing at Senka. He lay stretched out on the floor, lazily tracking a fly circling near the ceiling. Sunlight spilled across his thick grey fur, highlighting the dark rings on his tail and his massive paws with long, sharp claws. He didn't look like any ordinary cat. "What kind of creature are you?" she asked softly. Senka turned his head and looked at her with his yellow eyes, pupils vertical like a predator's. There was no malice or wildness in them, only calm understanding. The next day, a vet from the district center arrived in the village, a tall, lean man with glasses. He was quickly taken to Granny Agafya's house. "Are you Agafya?" a neighbor boy asked him. "She's got a real beast living with her." The vet chuckled. "Well, let's take a look at this beast then." Granny met him on the porch, arms crossed. "What do you want?" "They told me there's a wild animal here," the vet said politely. "I need to check if it's dangerous." "Dangerous or not, he's mine," she snapped, but let him in. Senka sat by the stove and stunned the vet at first sight. He froze, slowly removed his glasses, wiped them, and put them back on. "That's a manual," he finally breathed. "A what?" "A wild steppe cat. They don't live around here. The nearest population is over 1,000 kilometers away." Granny watched silently as the vet cautiously approached. Senka didn't hiss or run. He simply sat there, watching the man with a heavy, evaluating gaze. "Incredible," the vet murmured. "An adult male. Healthy. How did he get here?" "Found him in the rain," she answered shortly. "He belongs in a zoo or a nature reserve. It's a rare, protected species." Senka suddenly turned his head and stared at the vet, who instinctively took a step back. "You see? He doesn't want to go. He's mine," she said firmly. "I nursed him back to health. I fed him. If he wants to leave, he will. On his own." The vet started to protest, but met Senka's gaze and fell silent. A minute later, he was packing his bag. "All right, but be careful. He's still a wild animal." "He's not wild," she replied, walking him to the door. That evening, she sat on the porch, watching the sun set behind the forest. Senka lay beside her, his heavy head resting on her knees. "So, Senka," she said, scratching behind his ear, "turns out you're a rare creature." He purred in response, a deep sound like distant thunder. He raised his head, looked into her eyes, then slowly, as if giving her time to pull away, nuzzled her wrinkled cheek. Granny laughed. "You silly beast." Meanwhile, the village was already buzzing with a new tale. The old woman who tamed a wild predator. Now, when neighbors passed her house, they slowed their steps and greeted her with newfound respect. Children tossed scraps of meat into her garden for the manul. Senka accepted their offerings, but never ate in front of people. He would take the meat into the house for Granny. Spring passed. Summer arrived. One morning, Granny woke up to an unusual silence. Senka wasn't in his usual spot by the door. "Senka?" She stepped outside, looked around, and saw a grey figure sitting on a sunlit hill near the edge of the forest. Senka was gazing into the distance, not at the village or the house, but far beyond the woods and hills. She walked up to him. "Thinking of freedom, my boy?" He turned to look at her. There was no sorrow in his eyes, only calm understanding. She sat beside him, stroked his back. If you want to go, go. Senka closed his eyes, nuzzled her hand, then stood up, stretched, and walked toward the forest. Granny watched him go, but her heart didn't ache. He stopped at the edge of the trees. Turned. Go on, she nodded. You're free. Senka looked at her one last time, then disappeared into the green thicket. Granny sighed, adjusted her scarf, and walked back home. That evening, as she sat on the porch with a cup of tea, a grey shadow emerged from the darkness. Senka walked up, laid a freshly caught hare at her feet, and curled up beside her as if nothing had happened. Granny laughed and stroked his head. He wasn't just a cat, he wasn't just a beast. He was someone who once heard the call of kindness and stayed. Senka stayed with Granny Agafya for good. Every morning, he greeted her with a gentle purr. Every evening, he warmed her feet with his thick fur. He wasn't just a cat. He wasn't just an animal. He became part of her heart. Loyal, devoted, real. And to think, it all began with a simple act of compassion toward a small, shivering creature in the rain. Dear friends, if this story touched your heart, leave a like and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss more heartfelt tales. Tell us in the comments what city or country you're watching from. Have you ever experienced a miracle like this, when an animal changed your life? Let's spread kindness. Sometimes it returns in the most unexpected ways. Maybe one day, happiness will smile upon you too, under the rain.